Let me first of all start with the thesis I would like to explore in this module. The way in which we conceive of theology determines the way in which we learn about theology, and therefore also the way in which we teach theology. Since theology as fides quaerens intellectum, faith in search of understanding, is fundamentally a hermeneutical endeavor, learning about theology is engaging in a hermeneutical exercise. Learning about theology, in other words, is hermeneutical learning. Consequently, teaching theology is taking students along a hermeneutical journey in order to get them acquainted with the hermeneutical nature of theology. In this way, they themselves become able to fully engage in the continual task of hermeneutics. The aim of hermeneutical learning in theology is for oneself to become a hermeneutical theologian. In essence, theology is about the hermeneutics of both the God who reveals God's self to us and our answer in faith to this revelation. To be sure, revelation and faith are intertwined. They are two sides of the same coin. It is in and through our faithful response that God's revelation takes shape. As fides quaerens intellectum, theology searches to understand this interplay of revelation and faith in order to reach a contemporary reflexive account of Christian faith and all that entails: spirituality, liturgy, ethical praxis, community, proclamation, and so on. In short, it is learning to read and interpret history and the world from the perspective of God's salvific revelation. Learning to reflexively engage with revelation and faith, in other words, doing theology, is precisely familiarizing oneself with such a hermeneutical task. Not simply to become acquainted with the task itself, but to actively contribute to its ongoing outworking into the future. This requires two interdependent movements. First, it involves acquainting oneself with the vocabularies, narratives, traditions, and theologies in which revelation and faith have been transmitted to us, and understanding how historical contexts intrinsically contributed to the formation of these vocabularies, narratives, traditions, and theologies. Second, it involves working towards an adequate understanding of revelation, faith, and theology within the current context. Situated within a hermeneutical circle, these two movements can be distinguished but not strictly separated, because learning about a tradition always already takes place within the current contemporary context. I would like to add two further comments to this. First, what I have said implies that appreciating how vocabularies, narratives, traditions, and theologies from the past offer insight into God revealing God's self in history is closely linked to the way people receive God's revelation in faith today. We interpret past faith expressions on the basis of our current interpretations and experiences of faith. Current experiences and interpretations may shed light on, but also challenge past expressions, and vice versa. Past expressions of how God's revelation has been received may direct, but also question current experiences and interpretations. A theological hermeneutics, therefore, entails a hermeneutics of tradition, engaging the past and the present at the same time. Further, and this is my second additional remark, this means that although immersing oneself in Christian faith entails learning to interpret history and the world from the perspective of God's salvific revelation, one can never claim a God's-eye perspective on history and the world, because one is always already part of this history and situated in this world. It is from within our own context that we learn about God's involvement in history. It is from within our own context that we reflect on faith experiences and interpretations, past and present. In theology, therefore, there is no epistemological observer's position. We are all inescapably participants in the continual hermeneutics of revelation and faith. This explains why all theology is necessarily contextual theology, historically and socio-culturally situated. This also explains why the enduring assignment of theologians consists in recontextualizing Christian faith in today's contexts. And so, a theological hermeneutics should be aware that a hermeneutics of revelation, faith and tradition, past and present, is unavoidably undertaken from within the present historical socio-cultural context. I would now like to develop my central argument more systematically, by first shedding some light on the theological foundation of what I have said so far, and highlight the dialogical nature of revelation. Second, I will evoke the hermeneutical circle of experience and interpretation that characterizes our coming to understanding of the faith. Third, I will introduce the category of recontextualization as a contemporary method with which to understand tradition development and doing theology today. And finally, I will employ the theological category of interruption to conceive of God's dialogue with humankind in history today. By way of conclusion, I will draw some consequences for the learning and teaching of theology. My first point, a dialogical concept of revelation. Revelation is first and foremost God reaching out to humanity in history and the world. Since Dei Verbum, the Constitution on Divine Revelation from the Second Vatican Council, the Church no longer understands revelation from its sources, Scripture and tradition, but as the encounter of God with human beings in the world and history. In the words of the Constitution, revelation concerns the salvific event of God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ and the Spirit. Revelation, therefore, is primarily a dialogical event in history. As a consequence, Scripture and tradition, including dogmas and doctrines, are revelation only to the extent that they bear witness to that original event, and as privileged witnesses, they offer keys for tracing God's revelation today and tomorrow. Moreover, once such a dialogical conception of revelation is embraced, the dialogue continues forever, because God also reaches out to humanity today. This is why tradition develops over time, because God reveals God's self in concretely situated historical contexts, and these contexts contribute to the way in which God's revelation is witnessed. This is why texts and practices do not stand on their own, but need to be interpreted again and again in changing contexts. For texts and practices receive their theological significance from their ability to point to the mystery of God entering into dialogue with humanity in the midst of the diversity of former and contemporary contexts. This is also why faith is not simply the acceptance of revealed truths or established teachings, but the trusting response to God's invitation to dialogue, and in a metaphorical sense, learning to read history through God's eyes. This brings me to my second point, a dynamic interplay of experience and interpretation. From an epistemological perspective, faith therefore involves a hermeneutical process of experience and interpretation. Given our situatedness in history and the world, God's offer of revelation and its reception in faith are intrinsically intertwined. On the one hand, our current faith experiences are formed and informed by the faith expressions, the interpretations handed down to us by the faith community in which we were initiated. At the same time, our faith experiences bring these received expressions to life. They do not stand on their own, but bear witness to God's revelation in history, also today. On the other hand, however, our faith experiences are also formed and informed by the contemporary context in which we and our faith community live. We live in today's world, not that of yesterday. We are conditioned by the present context in ways that influence our vocabularies, thinking patterns, worldviews, and so on. This inescapably qualifies the way we perceive God revealing God's self to us today, and thus also the way we express our response in faith. The combination of historical faith expressions handed down to us and contextual faith experiences therefore engenders a mutually critical constructive process in which existing interpretations and new experiences of faith are intertwined. The result is a contemporary understanding of the faith. This ongoing hermeneutical process of experience and interpretation is the engine of tradition development. Due to shifts in the context, older interpretations lose their pertinence and no longer appear able to bear witness to the God who reveals God's self in history in contextually plausible and theologically legitimate ways. Emerging from the mutually critical constructive process of faith interpretations and faith experiences, a more suitable understanding of the faith may appear, offering a relevant faith expression that enables us to perceive how, even today, God is salvifically involved with God's people in history. A good example is offered by contemporary theologies of creation, responding both to the modern developments in science, the science-faith debate, and the contemporary discussions about climate change. This has resulted in creation theologies that are critical of both creationism and anthropocentrism, and concern themselves with new accounts of creational interdependency and human ecological global responsibility. My third point, recontextualization, both a tool to analyze tradition development and a theological program. Understanding Revelation as the dialogue of God with humanity in the world and in history leads to a continuous development of tradition and a continuous hermeneutics of tradition. Tradition and its interpretation are witnesses to God's revelation. Methodologically, this involves an ongoing process of recontextualization. Indeed, recontextualization and not contextualization. There is no original contextless account of God revealing God's self in history, which then, in a second move, is to be translated into a diversity of contexts. One needs, for instance, a lot of knowledge about the historical and socio-cultural context of both Jesus and the evangelists to grasp the ways in which the Gospels present various accounts of Jesus as the Christ. It is only from such a thoroughly hermeneutical perspective that one can appreciate that Jesus Christ is the definitive revelation of God to humanity in history. What that means needs to be reconsidered time and again on the basis of such historically situated contextual accounts. As a methodological concept, recontextualization functions in both a descriptive and a normative way. As a descriptive category, it assists theology by analyzing the ways in which tradition has been challenged by contextual change and novelty. Historically speaking, reactions to change have varied on a continuum. On the one hand, there is stubborn condemnation and suppression of this novelty in an attempt to uphold the tradition uncontaminated. On the other hand, there is the uncritical embracing of and adaptation to cultural newness, at the risk of watering down the tradition's specificity, and everything in between. From a descriptive perspective, for instance, traditionalist attempts to resist new cultural influences in order to protect the integrity of the tradition are to be recognized as recontextualizations, just as much as more liberal attempts to positively integrate new trends. Since the context has changed, so also the relation of a seemingly unaltered tradition to this context has necessarily changed. As a normative category, recontextualization calls for a theological program, whereby the insight of the intrinsic link between revelation, faith, and context inspires theologians to take the contextual challenges seriously in order to come to a contemporary theological understanding of revelation and faith. To be appropriate, such a theological program at the same time strives for contextual plausibility as well as theological legitimacy. First, a recontextualization acquires contextual plausibility when it succeeds in critically, constructively dealing with the context and the context's criticisms vis-à-vis the Christian faith. This involves both self-critically engaging the challenges posed by the context and tapping into its own resources to handling these contextual challenges. Second, a recontextualization is theologically legitimate when the critical constructive engagement with the new context results, at the same time, in an appropriate interpretation of the Christian faith on the basis of a rereading of Scripture and tradition, and in discussion with theologians past and present. Such recontextualization offers Christians a renewed self-understanding that enables them to situate themselves within the Christian tradition, as well as to relate as Christians to their contemporary context. Through the ages, dialogue with contemporary philosophy has served this programmatic purpose of recontextualization. The case of Thomas Aquinas illustrates this very well. The rediscovery of the philosophical work of Aristotle in the Middle Ages challenged the theologians who were until then schooled in rather Platonist, Augustinian ways of doing theology. It resulted in the emergence of a new kind of theology, scholasticism. Such recontextualization did not happen without discussion and conflict, and even led, in the case of Aquinas, to the condemnation of some of his theses a few years later after his death in 1277. In the same way, theologians have always borrowed models, patterns, ideas, and terminology from philosophy and the broader culture in order to develop, structure, support, or flesh out their own understanding of what Christian faith is about. This brings me to my fourth point, understanding God's revelatory dialogue with us today. The category of interruption. Similarly, today, recontextualizing theology can be unsettling and far from self-evident. The outcome of the hermeneutical dialogue cannot be presumed or known in advance. In dialogue, one is challenged to express one's standpoint and to respond to what the other person brings to the table. Dialogue not only offers insight about the other, but above all about oneself, and can lead to self-criticism, to deeper understanding, but also to changing one's perspective. For those who seek security, dialogue at the very least brings uncertainty and implies danger. Dialogue is not about the self-assured exchange of a preformed identity, but fundamentally contributes to the formation of that identity. Moreover, from within a Christian dialogical understanding of revelation, dialogue is not an empty formal category, but is narratively charged by the testimonies and stories of God's encounter with humanity in the world and history. In this context, the German political theologian Johann Baptist Metz spoke of the dangerous memory of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The question of where and how God speaks is always colored by this memory. How then can we think today about the dangerous nature of God's revelation in history? I have often appealed to the category of interruption for this purpose. When God is locked up in doctrines and texts, in fixed practices and identities, it is God self who interrupts them. And it is in the dialogue with concrete others, often with those we do not expect, that this interruption can take place. We can see this, for example, in the experience of Jesus when he encountered the Syrophoenician woman who asked him to heal her daughter. At first, Jesus refuses, because it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But in the conversation with the woman, she teaches him that God's salvation cannot be limited to the people of Israel, because even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Jesus' own image of God is interrupted and transformed. The category of interruption makes it possible to understand God's critical involvement in history and to interpret the history of God's dialogue with humanity witnessed by stories and practices. Whenever our search for truth leads to closure and exclusion, to self-protective certainty and power, it is God self who interrupts us through concrete encounters, through the victims of such exclusion, through those who are in danger of not being heard. My conclusion: teaching theology is only possible because of the teacher's own hermeneutical learning and necessitates the involvement of students in the very same learning processes. It requires one to take part from an inescapable participant's perspective in a critical constructive dialogue between past and present, between tradition and context, fueled by the dynamic interplay of experience and interpretation. It entails reading texts, analyzing practices, interpreting histories, studying contexts and discussions with colleagues. Ultimately, it is about tracing where and how God reveals God's self to humanity in history, especially today, and what it means to be a Christian and a theologian.